Looks like we're live. How's everyone doing tonight? So I think what we're going to do is just wait a couple of minutes here for a few more folks to show up for the talk here, and we'll get started with the slideshow as soon as that's said and done. Just want to first do a quick audio test, make sure everyone can hear me. If you guys can hear me and there's no distortion or anything like that, please just leave a quick comment just with a thumbs up or saying I can hear you, just to let me know. Sounds great. You guys can hear me? Awesome. All right, so like I said, I think we're just going to hang on a minute here. My internet is lagging a bit. Just going to let it catch up. Okay. Well, hope everyone's doing well tonight. My name is Alexander Pedikov. I'm going to be doing a talk here for the Nashua, New Hampshire Public Library, which is pretty cool. It's a library in my town, so that is really cool. And it's unfortunate they couldn't be in person, but as we know, with all the circumstances and things that have been happening, this is sort of a new idea, new thing to try out here with doing a virtual talk. So I'm going to start that off. Let me just get one technical thing real quick straightened out here. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Just want to make sure we have somebody keeping an eye on everything in the technical side. So, all right, without further ado, let's get started here. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about the Granite State Bigfoot. So the Granite State refers to New Hampshire, of course. And we're going to be talking about Bigfoot sightings and history sort of in the area, and a little bit of an overall sort of talk about Bigfoot. Oh, I should probably forgot to add the actual PowerPoint. There we go. Let's try that. This is all new, folks. So like I said, this is sort of a new idea. So we're just trying to make it work. But let's see if I can get this to go. There we go. All right, so like I said, we're going to be talking about Bigfoot in the Granite State of New Hampshire tonight. And before we really get started, I just want to give a little shout out to my friend Michael Mitchell. He unfortunately passed away in 2019. He was a good friend here from New Hampshire. He did an awesome job with his wife, Michelle. They ran Mitchell Comics. They did comics about all sorts of interesting topics, the Exeter UFO incident, the Granite State Bigfoot. That was one that we got to collaborate on. So this is myself and Michael here, and it was very cool putting together some of the concepts for the comic book. And he, as I mentioned, unfortunately passed away. So this presentation on Granite State Bigfoot is dedicated to Michael Mitchell. So just a little bit about myself. My name is Alexander Pedikov. I am a filmmaker. I'm into photography, multimedia content, as well as traveling, hiking, adventuring, and searching for the unknown, of course. That's the reason I'm here, to talk about an unknown subject that is Bigfoot. Just a little bit of background on some of my work. 2016, I directed a short documentary called Mystery at Loch Ness, which is really just sort of my first mini documentary on the subject of cryptozoology and the unknown. So that was kind of cool. You can still watch that on YouTube. Just a short little film about the Loch Ness Monster, which everyone, of course, knows so much about. So Sasquatch Out of the Shadows, which for some of you, probably this is how you're watching this presentation here, is sort of a documentary series I came up with in 2016. It's very open-ended. It's turned into this YouTube channel now where I do live shows with a variety of different guests that from across the country and the world, talking about the subject of Bigfoot and the unknown and all sorts of other subjects. But there is a mini series that you can watch, and we're actually going to be watching one of the episodes here tonight called Shyman of the White Mountains after the presentation's concluded. This, of course, is the Granite State Bigfoot comic book. So this was in 2018 that I collaborated with Michael Mitchell, as I said. It's a very cool little comic book about some of my favorite sightings here in New Hampshire, and I'm going to talk about a few of those tonight. It is available on my website. Unfortunately, Square just decided to change the format of my website, so it kind of threw everything into a disarray. I have to go in there and fix it, but if you give it some time and patience, if you want to check it out, this was available on my website, Petticoat Media. On the Trail of Champ was a miniseries documentary I did in 2018, filmed in 2017, released in 2018, all about the Lake Champlain monster, of course, of Vermont and New York. Very famous lake monster story. Lions of the East is my latest documentary, which I just released right before the whole coronavirus thing kicked off in March of 2020. And it's a documentary that examines the decades of mountain lions and mystery big cat sightings throughout New England. So it's a pretty interesting look into that sort of phenomenon, exactly what's been going on. And I'm hoping to do an official premiere coming up here in the fall, maybe end of the summer, fall, most likely the fall, since the premiere I was going to have last time was unfortunately skirted due to coronavirus. But keep your eyes peeled for that. I do have a few DVDs of this left on my website, as well as digital copies. So if that's something you're interested in, check that out. This is just a map I've come up with, a New England cryptids map. Came up with that in 2019. And it's just a map with all the states of New England and some of the strange sort of activity and sightings that are going on there with these cryptids. It's just sort of a fun list. Some are obviously more mythical, like perhaps the Wendigo, and then you have mountain lions and those sorts of things, which would fit more into the biological scale. On that note, let's talk about briefly cryptozoology. So cryptozoology is the study of hidden or undiscovered animals. You have cryptids like Sasquatch, lake monsters, all sorts of things, the Dover demon, out-of-place animals like mountain lions, and even creatures thought to be extinct like the coelacanth and the thylacine. So these are just a couple examples of former cryptids. You have the okapi, which is this bizarre, almost giraffe, zebra-looking animal that is found in Africa that wasn't discovered until the 20th century, actually. And it's kind of something that's very hard to come up with what this animal looks like. Of course, we have the gorilla. For centuries, locals in parts of Africa told stories of hairy, upright, man-like creatures that were, very large and scary. Sounds kind of familiar, I'm sure. It was thought to be a myth, of course, until it was proven to be a real animal. We have the giant squid, maybe perhaps stories of the kraken and those sorts of things, and the coelacanth, which was thought to be previously extinct, very prehistoric-looking fish, until off the coast of South Africa in the 1930s, there were live specimens that were pulled up, and now we know where there are established populations of these animals. So it's kind of a poster child of cryptozoology in general. Of course, in cryptozoology, there's an element of mythology and folklore. A lot of these old stories like stories of dragons and sea monsters, are they perhaps based in some form of reality, or is it all just fanciful thinking? That's something we always have to keep in mind. Things like the Piazza bird, which is a Native American folklore story from the Midwest. Of course, like I said, sea monsters. You have the Beast of Gévaudan, sort of the original werewolf from France, the dragon, naturally, and then the woodwoes, or sort of old stories of hairy men, and that's hairy wild men kind of living in the mountains. And that's where we'll talk about that in a minute. But just my approach, just very briefly to go over that, is boots on the ground. So you visit the location that you're going to be doing a film in or talking to people. You interview locals, witnesses, researchers, experts, skeptics even. You want to really talk to people who kind of know the area. If I'm going into an area or a place I've never been, I can't just be expected to know everything about the flora and the fauna and the stories. And you've got to talk to locals and people who live in that environment, who research there all the time. And let interviewees tell their stories. So don't have leading questions. Keep it kind of open-ended so that they tell you their full story without planting any ideas or anything in their head. So the documentaries, they serve as a way to preserve the experiences and regional folklore more than anything. It creates a wider awareness of the subject, whether it's a creature, phenomena, or just an interesting tale. And the ultimate goal is to create informative and entertaining documentaries that take these subjects very seriously. I've got a New England focus, being in New England, of course. So the origins of Bigfoot. This is just a little bit, some cultural background on some of these stories. Throughout history, various cultures around the world have had stories of hairy man-like creatures that live in the deep, dark crevices in the corners of our world and the outskirts of civilization. So it's a pretty interesting sort of idea. Whether or not they're real, there's always been that sort of interest in these kind of creatures and stories of these creatures going back to the beginnings of organized human civilization. You have this is a picture, for example, of a knight battling some sort of a hairy man-like creature. I thought that was an interesting one to include. And just to note, the PowerPoint is going to feature a lot of visuals. I like to keep it as visual as possible in terms of exactly what I'm talking about. So in a European context, you have stories of things like the wood woes seen throughout medieval folklore. Now, whether or not that's representative of some sort of Bigfoot-like creature, I'm not saying it is. This is just something that is interesting, and I think just kind of plays into that cultural phenomena, that cultural perspective that we as humans tend to have. And you'll see as we go through different parts of the world how that's very present. Of course, you have stories of the Almas and the Almasti, which are something found more in Eastern Europe and into Russia and Siberia and even into the Caucasus. As, for example, one of these pictures here shows what appears to be a human interacting with one of these creatures. And there were even stories of interbreeding with sort of local creatures that were found in the mountains up in that area, in the Caucasus in particular. Now, this is an area where there's been a lot of discoveries made on the front of human evolution and our ancestors and different species of the Denisovans, cavemen, Neanderthal, whatever you want to kind of call them. A lot has been found on that front. In Asia, it's very interesting, especially in China and Nepal and Tibet and Bhutan and these sorts of areas. You have stories like the Yeti, of course, very famous, very popular story. Everyone has heard of the Yeti or the abominable snowman. The Yeren in China. You've got the rock apes in Vietnam. And there's actually some very interesting stories told by U.S. service members who served in the war in Vietnam of seeing these sorts of creatures. Orang pendek, the little people almost, the little hairy people seen in Indonesia. Now, this is a story that is very interesting because there are sightings to this day of a creature called the orang pendek, but you have folklore going back to the locals as well as the Dutch when they colonized the area. And you have islands like the island of Flores, where the Homo floresiensis was discovered not that long ago, which was sort of an offshoot of the human lineage, but very small people. Very interesting. And these are some depictions of, I guess you could call hairy people in folklore. Obviously, this guy is not having a great time, or gal here, with being torn apart by two of these Yeti-like creatures. So it's very interesting just to see these depictions because these are, of course, not new depictions. In Australia, you have something like the Yowie, wild men. These are just some depictions of that. And Australia, of course, is a sort of a divergent continent. A lot of very strange and unusual animals live there, from the platypus to kangaroos and wallabies. These are animals that evolved in a very strange sort of way. So there are stories of the Yowie there as well, which I think is pretty interesting. North America, I think, probably has the richest history in terms of stories. You have Native American and First Nation people telling stories of strange things across really the continent. I mean, these are some pretty incredible depictions of artwork. These people being chased by these large creatures is from, I believe, the Iroquois Nation, one of their tribes, depicting stone giants. And you can clearly see there's a difference between these sorts of things and the people that are shooting arrows and kind of being chased. And the one on the right is a costume, some sort of traditional costume from coastal tribes in British Columbia. And it looks very similar to maybe a modern ape costume that you might be able to find, which is really interesting. How would a group of people that were isolated in the mountains of British Columbia in the temperate rainforest there know what apes looked like to create something like this? I think this photograph is from the early 20th century or the late 19th century. I'm not exactly sure, but it's a very interesting photo. I thought I would include that. This, of course, is a famous one that's always pointed to in California. One of the tribes there has sort of a depiction of the hairy men or the hairy people. And these are also from the coastal tribes there in British Columbia. Very interesting masks. I mean, some anthropologists and scientists have looked and said, well, it looks very similar to ape features that you might see on modern day apes. You know, the baring of the teeth is something that chimps do when they're feeling aggressed, or they feel that somebody's being an aggressor to them, or they're sort of trying to intimidate somebody, as well as the hooting. I mean, maybe that's what these masks depict. I don't know, but they're very interesting that they show, something that if this was not a creature they're observing, what's the point of creating this sort of stuff? So that's just something interesting to think about. I'm not saying that has to be what we think of in the modern context as Bigfoot, but it's definitely an interesting piece of this strange puzzle. This is the only place that has really a lot of text here in the slide, I promise. Just in terms of the European colonization of North America, of course, you have people that came in large numbers and moved through the continent throughout hundreds of years into very wild areas. I mean, they were talking all sorts of environments, from the swamps down south to the mountains in the Northeast, and in the Midwest, the plains, and then out to the West Coast and everything in between. So one of the first actual encounters of a wild man type creature was described in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1765. It was an account of a strange animal that was seen as resembling the human species, yet is monstrous in its natures and actions. It had the appearance of the hide of a large bear and white and bushy head with a dark and leathery face. Some people have pointed to that perhaps being the first recorded Bigfoot sighting. Of course, in the modern context, that's how we're kind of attributing it, but it's still an interesting story that was told at that time. Daniel Boone told stories of killing a 10-foot tall, hairy Yahoo, as he called it, in Kentucky in the early 1800s. President Teddy Roosevelt wrote in 1893 in a book that he had heard strange howls while hunting, and was actually told a pretty terrifying story by local guides of hairy man-like creatures that had terrorized hunters and apparently attacked a camp and killed a few of them. Very interesting story. And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was a avid outdoorsman and hunter and really spent a lot of time out there. So it's interesting that he was told this sort of story. Famous incident called Ape Canyon in 1924, one of the sort of pinnacle events, I suppose, of the Bigfoot phenomenon. It's always talked about and pointed to, of a group of miners in an area near Mount St. Helens in Washington State that said that they were attacked all night by this band of hairy, large creatures that was pelting rocks at their cabin, and they supposedly shot a few, and it was an all-night battle until they abandoned the area. And some have said that perhaps it was a group of kids that did this, or somebody else was attacking them, but it was definitely an interesting story. And then another sort of tall tale in this arena of interesting stories is the lumberjack Albert Ostman, who I believe was either an Austrian or German immigrant to Alberta or to British Columbia, Canada. And he said that he was held captive by a family of Sasquatch for a number of days and managed to escape by feeding one of the creatures a tin of tobacco. And it basically tried to eat the whole thing and went crazy, and that he made his escape, but he managed to observe multiple animals. He told this story later on. Now, there's been some doubt cast on the story. I'm not here to say that it's real or not. It's just an interesting story. There's plenty of other ones. Jacko, supposedly a captured wild man that was put on display in British Columbia. Lots of other stories like that. These are just a few. These are just some of the newspaper clippings from that time period. So here's one from 1924. Ape men 8 feet tall with hairy bodies like bears seen in Rocky Mountains. Pretty interesting. 1907, wild man startles people of Kentucky. Now, it's important to realize that during this time period, newspaper articles perhaps weren't the most truthful. I mean, some would argue probably that hasn't changed, but there was a phenomenon called yellow journalism, where sensationalist stories that were often exaggerated and sometimes completely fabricated just to sell newspapers, just to get ideas out there and just to get people buying newspapers. That was totally acceptable practice a lot of the time. So some of these stories talk about this, but I'm not saying that their stories are all made up, but maybe there are some exaggerated details, but they are very interesting, and I think they do play a part in this subject as well. So here we have big gorilla attacks Gettysburg resident, 1921, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And you'll notice there are newspapers from different areas oftentimes talking about this, like this one, the North Adams Transcript. So North Adams, Massachusetts, talking about wild man, or the Winstead wild man of in Connecticut, which was seen in the late 1800s and kind of terrorized some locals and led to a classic monster movie sort of pitchfork chase where locals were trying to track this thing down. Now, when we talk about Bigfoot, Sasquatch in sort of a modern context, we're going to just talk about where the word Sasquatch came from. So most people know of Bigfoot today, but Sasquatch was actually an anglicized word for Saskets in the coastal Salish peoples in British Columbia, who, as I showed with some of those masks and costumes, really had a wide variety of stories about these sorts of hairy people in the woods, if you want to call it that. And these are just some examples. Canada had a Sasquatch on a stamp, and this is actually a souvenir from Sasquatch back in the day, I think pre-1950. So they almost viewed it as more of a different tribe, like a lost tribe of people, more than perhaps the monstrous sort of depiction they might have today. The Abominable Snowman, or Yeti. As I mentioned earlier, that is a classic one. I think more people were probably familiar with that before Bigfoot really became popular in America. Everyone's heard of the Abominable Snowman and Bumble the Yeti from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, of course. And these are just two famous examples. We have the footprint supposedly taken from the Himalayas, and the infamous Pangboche hand, as well as the skull cap, supposedly the head of the Yeti in the hand. And there's been a lot of stories about these two items for decades, really. And I won't get too into detail, but there's been testing done. Supposedly the hand has been stolen from some of the monasteries up there in Nepal multiple times. So it's just, they're sacred objects in the area, but they're all part of the Yeti sort of folklore in that area. So when we're talking about Bigfoot, the term Bigfoot was actually coined in the 1950s in Northern California, a place near Bluff Creek, which was an area where there was logging going on in some of these very remote forests, and crews were supposedly finding large footprints, and they kind of called it, some sort of strange man, hairy man, whatever. But that's when the press actually coined it Bigfoot. It kind of seemed to make sense. And the way that the Associated Press and the Newswire system worked, that story was beamed out of Eureka, California, I believe, and it went viral as it could back in the day. And newswires across the country were carrying the story of Bigfoot. And that's really when that name sort of stuck. And that's why Bigfoot and the term have an association with Northern California. As you can see in that newspaper clipping, a new Sasquatch found, it's called Bigfoot. So there was that older name and the new one as well, which I think is interesting. And folks measuring the tracks that were found there. And there's been, some doubts cast on that, the involvement of Ray Wallace, who was a notable hoaxer at the time. Now, that being said, that's just all part of this is all just part of what we know is the modern context when you tell somebody who maybe has never even heard of Bigfoot what Bigfoot is. Of course, you have the famous Patterson-Gimlin footage. So I hope this will load. Patterson-Gimlin footage taken 1967, which depicts a female Sasquatch walking through this area, taken by two sort of cowboys out there that were searching for Bigfoot evidence. And Roger Patterson has passed away, but Bob Gimlin is still alive and sticks to the story. And he goes around and does a lot of talks about it now and has been interviewed about it dozens of times. So it's an interesting piece of footage. It's probably the most analyzed video after the Zapruder film, which shows the assassination of JFK. You'd be hard pressed to find something that's been covered to the extent of this. It's been scrutinized up and down and new revelations here and there all the time. And no one's really been able to prove or disprove it. And I don't think it'll ever prove that something like Bigfoot exists, but it's almost every depiction you see of Bigfoot shows that sort of that stride where the hands are going left to right. And it's based off of Patty from the Patterson-Gimlin film, as the nickname goes. So obviously, some of you will probably recognize some images here. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, very famous pop culturally. Sports teams, the Vancouver Winter Olympics, Bumble, video games, Red Dead Redemption, Far Cry and the Hendersons, Jackalinks, Beef Jerky, Smallfoot, just to name a few. There's been a lot of Bigfoot is a really interesting marketing tool because it's copyright free. Nobody owns the identity of Bigfoot, so anyone can use it. Like I said, from Beef Jerky, I've seen mattress commercials recently, political campaigns that involve Bigfoot. It's kind of an interesting thing because it's universal. People really kind of know at least what Bigfoot is. So it's a very interesting marketing tool, and it's used far and wide, and lots of movies and sorts of things about it. So I think it's kind of interesting. But let's get a little bit into really basically just some of the theories. And I'm not going to go into super depth about all these, but theories about what something like a Sasquatch could be. One of the more prominent ones perhaps is that of Gigantopithecus, which was supposedly this giant ape-like creature, one of the largest apes to exist in known history, that existed in parts of modern-day China and in Asia and Southeast Asia. It was a bamboo eater. There's really not a whole lot known. The only fossils that really exist of this creature are some teeth bones and part of a jaw that was actually discovered, I think in the 1930s in Chinese apothecary shops, and they were being sold as dragon bones and used for all sorts of ailments in Chinese medicine. And that's where actually a lot of fossil discoveries were made during that period with these bones that were dug up. And there really isn't too much evidence of this Gigantopithecus even existing aside from these few bones. So it's just very interesting how little fossil evidence you have for this massive creature, which could be a literal inspiration for King Kong, yet it existed. And we have some fossil evidence to prove that. So this is just a size chart showing you some of other ape-like creatures. As you can see, they have the orangutan humans, gorilla, Chewbacca, of course, and Gigantopithecus. So some people theorize that perhaps Gigantopithecus managed to make its way to North America and other parts of the world and has since adapted into what we know as Bigfoot. That's just one of the prevailing theories. It's one of the more popular ones as well, I'd say. Sticking similarly to that route of, thought to be extinct primates and ape-like creatures, we have the relic hominids, so Paranthropus, Neanderthal. These were creatures that were more similarly related to us. So they would have walked upright, perhaps even used tools. In Neanderthal, it's all kind of unknown, but some parts of the world still have sightings of Neanderthal-like creatures, or in parts of Russia and Siberia, they say that there are sightings of creatures that have tools or even are wearing fur. So it's almost more of a primitive man sort of depiction, as opposed to more of the just wild animal that's reported a lot in North America. Of course, some people think that there's a paranormal connection, perhaps alien or interdimensional, what have you. Lots of different stories. Maybe that's why they don't find bodies. That's often something that's pointed out. And it's just something interesting to consider. Hoaxes, of course, there's been plenty of hoaxes. You can't really trust anything you see on the internet. So like this depiction shows here of clearly a bear that was caught and killed, there is a Photoshop that was done. So you really can't trust anything that's online these days. And then, of course, you have famous hoaxes like the 2008 Georgia Bigfoot hoax. You have the footprint stomp hoaxes. This is Ray Wallace and some of his hoaxing gear. On that note, you have misidentification. Some people argue, well, it's upright bears being seen in strange and awkward positions. Maybe that makes it look like a hairy man-like creature. Of course, optical illusions. Your eyes can play a trick on you. You see something in the wrong kind of light, and wow, it looks like a person, or it looks like some sort of a thing. Or pareidolia, where you see faces where there isn't a face. That's a human trait, is to kind of see even pictures of leaves. You can almost see, well, that looks like a face there. So those are all just sorts of theories, and I'm not saying one or the other is true. I mean, it's not even certain if something like Bigfoot exists. I know many people here probably lean towards that, but it's of course important to always maintain skepticism. And that's just sort of a little bit of a basis about, what we're talking about, especially in regards to New Hampshire. So this is just a map, a distribution of some sightings across the country. And you'll notice, I want you to notice the clusters you have in certain parts of the country, such as the West Coast. So the states that have the most sightings are Washington, California, and Oregon, which, as you can see, and those areas are interesting because that's where the temperate rainforest is located. And then you'll notice the Midwest and into the South. So these are very swampy, lush environments all along up and down the Appalachian Mountains, a lot of greenery there. So we'll get into now. This is a map of annual average precipitation across the country. So of course, the eastern part of the country and into the south, you'll see there's a lot more rainfall. And this is all green, mostly forested, lots of mountains. Then you have the Midwest where that sort of drops off. And then into the Intermountain West, where you have pockets of green. That would be the Rocky Mountains and some of the other mountain ranges. And then the Sierra Nevadas, and look at Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. That's where the temperate rainforests have the most precipitation of anywhere in North America, which is really interesting. And then one more thing, this is just sort of talking about forestation levels. So you can see states like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, West Virginia, Alabama, and some of these other states are all over 50% forested, which is really interesting. This is where a lot of sightings take place. And you can notice some of these states out in the Midwest, the Dakotas, I mean, it's mostly prairies or mountainous terrain, really not a lot of woodland. Now, what's interesting is if you put all three of these maps together, and that, like I said, notice where the distribution of sightings tend to be the eastern part, where there's a lot of green, there's a lot of suitable habitat for things like the black bear, deer, other animals, moose in other areas. There's a lot of these sightings. Florida, which is subtropical, basically. I mean, they have the Everglades and some of these environments. And then, of course, on the West Coast. So that's just very interesting, the correlations here, I think, between sighting distributions and weather patterns. You don't seem to have as many in some of these arid, drier areas as you do in, say, Ohio or Florida, some of these other spots. Just some regional names across North America. There's so many different names. Of course, you got The Legend of Boggy Creek, famous film about a docudrama about the subject. And it's just one of the many names: the Fouke Monster, Momo, Lake Worth Monster, Old Yellowtop, Ontario, Canada, the Winstead Wildman. The list goes on and on. You can see just local sorts of stories. But now let's talk about New Hampshire. So this is actually a really cool wood cutout. I took this a couple years ago. This is up in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, very close to the Canadian border. And it depicts Bigfoot with some of his forest friends, as you can see, which I think is pretty interesting. You got moose, and he's holding a squirrel. And I have a newer picture I took of this in the summer, and you can see there's even a snapping turtle at the bottom. And there's just all these really cool critters. And I think it's a really cool depiction. And it's very close to the Vermont border as well as the Canadian border there in upstate New York. Upstate New Hampshire. So here's a map actually put together by a friend of mine, Crystal Panic, who is a New Hampshire Bigfoot researcher. This is just a cool map where she's put some pins on talking about some of the Bigfoot sightings across the state. So you can see there's different kinds of categories. You got Class A and Class B, all sorts of stuff. So just a couple of notes on that. Reports by county submitted to the BFRO, which is the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. They're not the only Bigfoot research organization out there, of course. They're just some of the data I'm looking at now, but there are plenty of other groups and individual researchers that have other sightings. But according to some of the data submitted to the BFRO, there's around 239 reports for New Hampshire. And you can see some of the counties that have the most. You have Rockingham and Hillsborough and Grafton, all within the 30s for terms of sightings. Hillsborough, of course, is the county that Nashua is in, public library as well. So some of these areas. Coos, which is the furthest north, which contains a lot of the North Country and the Great North Woods, only has around 24. Now, again, this is according to just the data here. So just something, a note from Crystal. I'm currently working about 30 cases and need to finish closing a bunch. I do have a backlog that I'm currently working on as well. A large number of reports that have come in were obvious hoaxes, jokes, or assumed hoaxes, and those are closed out right away. And that's something that happens when you have the online world. People can just really submit anything. And what the BFRO does, which I think is a good approach, is when a report is submitted, that report will go to a local researcher within that area, whatever state you're in or territory. It'll go to a local researcher, and if the witness or the person submitting the report chooses to add personal information, such as a phone number to be reached, that's a good thing, because then the researchers will contact them back, talk to them about their experience. And if they deem the person to be, not pulling a joke or just trying to get on TV or something, they might actually even go do a field investigation at the person's property, or even, kind of interview them further, which I think is an interesting approach. And obviously it's certainly not only the BFRO that takes that approach. There's plenty of groups that do that, and plenty of researchers. And it's just a very responsible thing to do, I think, with these sorts of reports. This is an interesting, just a hair sample that was shared from Crystal to me a couple of years ago. I am not entirely familiar with the testing. I believe they did do some testing on the sample, and it was found to be horse, but supposedly there's still some other sample that hasn't been tested. I'm not entirely sure about that, but it's an interesting case, I believe, where a gentleman was on a property and he was having creatures kind of visiting his property and kind of messing around with his horses and tying braids in their hair. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's the gist of the story, but figured I would just include that picture in there. So you have this pretty interesting story from northern New Hampshire called the Wood Devils in Coos County, which, as I mentioned, the furthest north. There's a lot of woods up there, Mount Washington, the Presidential Range, a lot of mountains up in there. Very interesting area. And that's where that Bigfoot wood cutout I showed you from Pittsburgh was. And this story kind of dates back to the days of the logging industry, heavy in the 1800s and late 1800s. And supposedly they told a story of strange creatures that were living in the woods, and they were tall and gray and hairy and would let out these screams at night, and you could almost walk into one before actually seeing one, which is kind of interesting. This is just a picture actually I took from hiking up to, was that Mount Cabot? Yeah, Mount Cabot, looking into just the woods around Coos County there, north of Berlin, New Hampshire. Very interesting area. It was actually a hike October 2018. There was still foliage in the valleys, and we were hiking up to stay in the cabin on Mount Cabot, and we got hit with a sudden snowstorm, and it was a very cold, long night, but you're looking down into the valleys where it's in the 40s, and you're up on this 4,000 foot peak, and it's snowing. Took one of my buddies up with me, and it was his first time really doing an overnight hike like that, and he wasn't too thrilled about that, but it made for an extremely interesting experience. So just thought this was a cool picture to show of Coos County and some of the wilder areas up there right past the White Mountains. This is a book that I've been pointed to from 1888, which is the history of Coos County. It supposedly has the story of the Wood Devils, or one of the first mentions of it. Now, I did scan or check out a scan of a digital copy of it online. I wasn't able to find this term, but the software that's used to locate terms in books is not that great. So I'm really hoping once this situation that we're currently in with this pandemic starts to calm down, I'm able to actually go and pick up a copy and check it out at a library up there and see if I can track down the term or even find out more about the story. But it's a story that holds up in that area to this day. And I've even had a few folks tell me that, I used to be scared when I was a kid. My parents would tell me the stories of wood devils. There was something that was told to keep the kids from going too deep into the woods. The wood devils will get you up in that northern part of New Hampshire. So it's definitely a story I'm interested in really getting to the bottom of some of the history of it. This is, of course, Wood Devil Double IPA. So this is by 603 Brewery, and they do some great beer. Those of you into that kind of stuff, they have some other really great brews. I've never actually tried this one. I think this one's a little bit of a darker one, but obviously, as you can see, it has a cool depiction of a creature. It looks a little bit different than a Bigfoot, but it says, New Hampshire wood devils are similar to Bigfoot, but they rely on their thin stature to hide among the trees and sharp teeth to leave their mark. So I think that's kind of cool. I've been trying to pick this beer up for a while, and I can never seem to find it. I think they only do it seasonally. So if anyone has one of these or knows where to get some readily, let me know, because I definitely would be interested in just trying this beer out and keeping one of the tins or one of the bottles as a souvenir. So now on to one of my favorite Bigfoot stories in New Hampshire. It's from Hollis, New Hampshire, nicknamed the Hollis Flea Monster. So this is a really interesting one. Basically, where to begin with this story? This is one that was said to have taken place in 1977 in Hollis, New Hampshire, which at the time was a little bit more rural than it would be today. It's a little bit more built up, but it's still a lot of woods and a lot of territory out there. And there's a flea market in Hollis. And supposedly in 1977, there were a couple of incidents. There's a couple of versions of the story, but the timeline sort of flows in the sense that a couple of incidents where people reported seeing a hairy, large, upright creature that was covered in a blondish brown fur or some sort of hair. One incident, it was seen crouching behind one of the classic New England stone rock walls that we have all over in the woods from when the area was logged and heavily deforested. Another one, a woman reportedly had her trailer shaken by this sort of a creature. And then the third story, which I think is the most interesting and the one that kind of ties the whole story together, was that of the flea monster, or at the flea market, of course. And a gentleman from Lowell, Massachusetts, and I'll actually pull up the original Nashua Telegraph article about it from 1977, saying a Lowell man flees Hollis after sighting monster. Police here are awaiting the return of a Lowell, Massachusetts man identified only as Mr. St. Louis after he reported seeing a 10-foot tall hairy monster Saturday night at the Hollis flea market. So supposedly what happened, I mean, that's really the only clip of it, is just this sort of little piece that was published. Supposedly the gentleman, Mr. St. Louis, Gerald St. Louis was the name actually, he was there with his sons, and they were set up on a Saturday night camping out, I think in the trailer of their truck, just getting ready to do a flea market in the morning. Next day, Sunday, I believe, when the flea market is happening. And they were in there, and there's two different versions of the story, but they both sort of involve a creature, of course, where they were sleeping in the car, they were sleeping in the truck, and something began to shake the vehicle. The son said that there was something out there and they were scared. And then Mr. St. Louis got out of the vehicle and actually confronted this thing. And in one version of the story, something brushed up against his shoulder, and it was this large man-like creature standing there, and it absolutely scared him. In the other version of the story, he shined a light at it and it stuck its tongue out at him, but he could tell it was this massive creature that smelled like rotting fish. That was what was described. Very interesting sort of story, I suppose. And it scared him so bad that he immediately got into the truck, left the trailer that they had for some of the stuff for the flea market. They left it there and just hightailed it out of there. They went to the HOLLIS police department, gave them a report, told them they had seen this kind of creature, and just went home to Massachusetts. And as it says in the article, police here are awaiting the return of a Lowell man. So he had left his trailer, as I mentioned, there at the flea market. So he obviously was pretty disturbed by this. And the story gets even more interesting where in the months following, a anthropologist actually from Peabody Museum at Harvard named Carlton Kuhn, who was at the time a well-respected anthropologist. There's been some controversy cast upon his work since then, but just in this, for the sake of this story, he was somebody that was involved. He was credible at the time, at least, and he began. I don't know how he got involved. This is something as well that I'm trying to get to the bottom of. Somehow he was interested in the subject of Bigfoot and was sent to this little town over the Massachusetts border in New Hampshire, as he described it, to look at this case. And he did a couple of polygraph examinations, actually, with St. Louis and his sons as well, just kind of trying to see what they were talking about. And I'm just going to have to minimize my screen here for a moment just so I can quote exactly what he said. So this is exactly what Carlton Kuhn said. He said, "A year ago, as a representative of the Peabody Museum of Harvard, I was sent to a town in New Hampshire just over the Massachusetts border to investigate a sighting. I went there twice. The terrain was a deep mat of fallen white pine needles. Several weeks after the encounter, the prints of what had been going on were still depressed 1.5 to 2 inches below the surface of the needles. Fully clothed, I weigh about 168 to 170 pounds and wear a size 12 shoe. My steppings and crawlings left no marks at all." That's a direct quote. So that's pretty interesting. And basically what Kuhn had come to a conclusion of when he did a polygraph on Mr. St. Louis and his sons was that they were telling the truth, at least about what they had experienced. They believed what they had seen, basically. He wasn't able to confirm, of course, not having been at the sighting. But it's very interesting how this guy got involved in this local Bigfoot story. And for that reason, it's probably one of my favorite local sort of Bigfoot stories. And people still call it, the Hollis flea monster and that sort of thing. And there's really not a whole lot known. And there's not much to the story aside from those few tales. And they supposedly did try to wrangle up the other witnesses as well, but not much came of it. I'm hoping to as well look into the Peabody Museum and check out Harvard's archives, maybe see if they have any further information about this, or even look into some of the collections of Mr. Kuhn and kind of some of the stuff that he had done, because he apparently had been convinced by this and wrote a paper, which has only appeared online once, to my knowledge, called "Why There Must Be a Bigfoot" or something along those lines, where he basically made a case for why something like this has to exist. And he referenced works by Grover Krantz, who was a scientist and a professor who had lent his credibility to the subject of Bigfoot, as well as other researchers at the time, John Green and others who had compiled the stories. And very interesting that this anthropologist was involved in this. So if anyone has any leads or anything like that, please feel free to let me know if they know anything more about the story. Maybe if you know anyone who was involved or is from Hollis, New Hampshire. It's always interesting when I do these talks in different parts of the state, and when there was still physical presentations going on, I would always have people at the end of the presentations come up and tell me about their stories and things that they had experienced and relatives they knew. So if anyone has any stories, just like at the physical events, feel free to email me or leave me a comment on this video and just kind of let me know if you have any stories about New Hampshire or anything else, because I'm really interested and I'd love to chronicle your stories. Now, this is just a little comic depiction of from the Granite State Bigfoot comic book that I did with depicting that evening in Hollis, New Hampshire. And you can see that in the Granite State Bigfoot comic book. Another one of my favorite stories from New Hampshire. Now, this one is called the Bald Mountain Curiosity. It took place in the Ossipee Mountain Range in 1979. The Ossipee Mountain Range, as you can see in this picture, really interesting geologically. It's sort of a circular mountain range almost, and it's just south of the White Mountains here. And there's some smaller peaks, and they're nothing over 4,000 feet, but all within the 3,000 foot range. And there's some pretty rough terrain in there. Well, in 1979, there was a man from a part of Maine who was up there. He was up in an area called Connor Pond. And this actually here is a picture of Connor Pond that I took maybe 2016 or 17. He was hiking up to one of these mountains. One of them is Bald Mountain. I don't know exactly which one, but I've driven up there just once just to kind of check out the area. And it was interesting that when I was there was just the leftovers of a deer skeleton. Obviously, the deer had probably fallen through the ice or had gotten stuck, had died there, and then was picked off by all sorts of predators and the conditions. So kind of neat to see that. Of course, it was a very warm day, so I didn't want to go on the ice and risk falling through, but it was just cool to see that from a distance. So this gentleman in 1979 was visiting the Ossipee Range with his girlfriend and their dog, and they were hiking, doing some mineral collecting up in the area, and they came to a sort of ledge up on one of the mountains, and they claimed to have seen a stone structure made of stacked rocks with a thatched hemlock sort of roof. And on the inside, they claimed that there was a large, hairy man-like creature just sitting there. This is one of the depictions from the Granite State Bigfoot comic book. But what happened next was really interesting. So they were watching this creature in there, and their dog apparently started to growl. And as soon as that happened, this thing let out some sort of a strange noise. It was very frightening, to the point where the gentleman decided to hightail it out of there with his girlfriend and their dog. And they ran halfway down the mountain before they realized they had a camera with them, but they were too terrified to go back up and get a picture of it. And I actually spoke to this guy at length a few years ago. It was very interesting. He's older in age now, of course, but he told me his story in detail. And he said, I still don't know what it was, but it sat there. It had matted fur or some sort of strange fur. And it's like its back was facing us. And it just sat there. And, we were so terrified. And so we just went down the mountain. And, it took him a year to get back up there, the courage to get back up there. He told me that apparently his girlfriend had gone to the Wolfboro Public Library, and had looked for stories about creatures or anything like that in this area, and had come across a story or a collection of stories with history of the area, where it claims that there was a gentleman living up on Connor Pond in the late 1800s, and he witnessed a dog walking on the ice, falling through, and that a large, hairy man came out of the woods, rescued the dog, and then took off into the woods. Now, I've not been able to track down the story, and I know somebody who works at the Wolfboro Library, and they're not able to confirm the story. I don't know, where the story was or what it was really about, aside from the location. So if anyone has any leads on that, of course, would be interested in that. But it is interesting that the one time I went up there, I see the deer obviously stuck up there in the ice that had passed away, similar to, I guess, the dog story, but we didn't see any hairy man-like creatures. But it's just one of those really interesting stories, especially since I think it involves a structure of sorts, whereas there's a lot of talk among the Bigfoot researchers and Bigfoot community that there are stick structures and little fort kind of structures that are created by these creatures. There haven't really been sightings of anything making them. And this is one of the only ones I can think of where there's sort of stones involved and a creature actually seen inside there. Now, according to this gentleman, as he told me after a lengthy phone call, he said, I still don't know what that thing was, but I think about it almost every day, because it was just such a very interesting encounter, even though it happened so long ago, 1979. So a very interesting story in the Bald Mountain Curiosity. So this is a wonderful depiction of a Sasquatch or a Shyman done by my friend Michael Eastman, who is in Shyman of the White Mountains. That's the documentary I'm going to be screening here right after the presentation shortly, which is just a documentary short about this subject. And I just want to talk a little bit about sort of the production of that. So in 2016, I had come into contact with Michael. He had been doing Bigfoot research in this area in Berlin, New Hampshire, north of the White Mountains, claim to have activity and all sorts of interesting stuff. And you'll see a little bit of that in the documentary. But on the process, we had multiple film dates and times we were actually shooting and in production. And some of the stuff we'd come across some interesting, as I mentioned, structure kind of things. And I'm not one to say that the structures are absolutely to do with Sasquatch, but across the country, there are researchers that purport that these structures are involved with Bigfoot, and they either serve as some sort of trail markers or obviously, nothing would live in something like this. But it is interesting that we'd find stuff like this in an area where people don't really go very often, and lots of ample evidence of other wildlife, including bear and moose and deer and all sorts of other game. But these are just a few pictures of some of the stuff we came across during that time. It's something like this, sort of interesting. You notice that there is a birch tree part of it right there in this supposed structure. So it's very interesting that you would see these. I mean, an area that was supposedly active with Sasquatch activity. As I said, I'm not saying that this is 100% attributable to that. I mean, a person could easily build this, but it doesn't look very natural. This does not look like something that would happen naturally. Of course, there are many instances where, especially New England, harsh winters will bend trees over, will break trees, snap them, all sorts of things. Bears can actually climb into little saplings and tip them over, and it almost looks like something snapped the sapling in half. It's interesting, but it's just, you see stuff like this, and it's just something that's, I think, kind of interesting, and you obviously cannot tell who made it or where it's from. We would find something like this. Of course, this could have been coincidental, things falling or somebody placing that there intentionally. Breaks that were going into different directions, twists like this. And then, like I said, though, a bear could technically rip down this tree if it was to climb up high enough, or even other animals might be able to perhaps do that. But some people have suggested perhaps that was a twist or a break, something that involves a lot of strength. This was a weird hair sample that we had found up there. And to this day, I've never gotten it tested. The testing actually is not as easy as you'd think. It costs a lot of money to get hair samples tested, and something we've never really gotten around to. Interesting. I mean, I think most likely it's probably bear. It was found kind of lodged in the side of a tree, but it is something interesting that we found up there. This was a footprint that we had found in the area. Could have been one of our own, but yeah, find that interesting. So this is just something really quickly, a possible trail camera hoax from up in that area. Just going to highlight it really quickly. Nothing, I can't give too many details about this, for your eyes only sort of thing, but this is supposedly a picture that was taken up in that area. And I think it resembles this costume in a lot of ways, if you look at it, if you kind of match them up that way. So now, this is an interesting photo that was sent to me by a friend of mine, saying that this was found in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, a supposed footprint. The only problem with this is I've had other people send it to me saying that this was taken in Massachusetts or another area. So I'm not really entirely sure what to make of it, but there's not much context. Of course, there's no scale. And if somebody's ever come across an interesting footprint in the woods, something that doesn't really look human or looks too big to be a human, I think it's really important to have something for scale when you take the photograph. Make sure there's something that you're able to tell exactly what it is. So I would suggest something very easy you can do is carry a dollar bill in your pocket. Everyone knows how long a dollar bill is in the dimensions. So, this person could have just thrown the dollar bill right next to it. We could have seen maybe this thing is, 15 inches long, or maybe it's 7 inches long. I mean, you can see it's a little bit smaller based on some of the grass, but that's very subjective. It's very hard to tell scale wise. So if you had a dollar bill on the side, it would be a much clearer indication of how big it is, even how deep it is. You could put the dollar in that way. And that's just something I recommend people carry out in the field. And even if you find a big moose print, I mean, I found big moose prints, bobcat prints, and it's always interesting, instead of carrying a tape measure or ruler, which you totally can do, just a dollar bill is probably one of the easiest things to carry. You can just slap it right next to a big moose print, be like, wow, that was a large moose. Okay, so SUNAPEE region, possible Class B encounter, February 2019. So just real quick, should have mentioned this earlier, but you have Class A encounters, which are a visual encounter where you visually see a creature. That's sort of the gold standard, I suppose, for Bigfoot sightings. For sightings of anything is a Class A. Class B would be you have sound, you hear stuff, you hear something strange. Class B and A, if you get both, I mean, that's obviously interesting. And I think a Class C is where there is really more of it's like a secondhand kind of story. But this is a story. I actually talked to this guy just today, a friend of mine who reached out to me in February 2019 saying that he had some pretty interesting stuff going on his property. He lived in the Sunapee area of New Hampshire. He claimed that he had heard some noises at night that were interesting. And this guy, I don't really have any reason to doubt him, rather. Nice guy. He's interested in this subject. I mean, not from a research standpoint. He just sort of peripherally listens to some of the podcasts and that sort of thing. And he reached out to myself and a few other researchers in the New England area, people that he knew, and said, I've had this interesting stuff happen where a couple nights in a row, or actually it was one night in February, he was out there at his property in his home with his family. They have a wood stove, and he went out, similar in many houses in New England, especially in New Hampshire, cold winters, they have a lot of wood cut in the backyard, like we see here in this shed. He went out there, took the cart, was loading up the cart. And what he would do was, to get some of the debris or dead bugs or whatever may be on some of that wood that's been dry there for months since the summer and the fall, he would take the two pieces of dry wood and kind of clap them together just to get some of the debris off and then load them onto that little cart. And you can imagine that sounds kind of like a knock. So just to preface, in a lot of Bigfoot encounters or supposed noises that are heard in relation to Sasquatch, people claim that wood knocking or knocking sounds are things that are heard as either a form of communication or some sort of a greeting. There's been a lot of theories. I mean, I've heard knocks out in the woods in the middle of the night, and it's kind of interesting and disconcerting because, there aren't very many animals that can do that. Now, it is interesting that chimpanzees actually can use or do use wood knocking as a form of communication. If there's a chimp maybe on a ridge and another one down the valley, they'll knock back and forth. That's like sending a text message for apes. So it's a behavior that's been reported in association with Sasquatch across the country. So it's just something interesting. But in this particular case, this guy, we'll just nickname him Mike to keep his info, of course, anonymous. Mike was out there and he was getting his wood. He would clap together the wood and put it in the cart. He said one night after doing this, he actually heard something in the woods, and he lives in an area that's, there's a few houses in his neighborhood, but it's surrounded by a lot of really good wilderness. And it's, a pretty wild area in general up there in Sunapee area. You have homes that are in rural areas. He heard something singular knock back from the woods, kind of in the distance. And he immediately thought, oh, it's just some other poor sucker out here, freezing cold night, just getting some wood for his family. Didn't really think too much of it, but then it was kind of strange. He's thinking like, why would somebody be out there? Another night, I think it was a few nights later, he kind of was alert a little bit, did the same sort of thing and got another response back and was very intrigued. And he kept doing that a couple nights in a row and had nothing else happen until I think the following week he was out there and it was in the daytime or right as it was getting dark and it was a little bit rainy, but he was checking something out. He had loaded up his car, was checking out a bird feeder he had in his yard, and he heard this kind of strange noise that he said sounded familiar. Said it sounded like an air raid siren, like a kind of noise. So he was kind of intrigued. He was listening to that, and he said that sounds so familiar, like an air raid siren. And he's like, well, no, it's actually something I've heard in some of these programs before, like a possible vocalization. He said he immediately then kind of pulled out his cell phone. He has a flip phone, a little bit old school. And as soon as he was trying to start recording the sound, it was almost like it was coming over the house from the woods. His family arrived and started making noise, and that was kind of the end of that. But it was just an interesting encounter, and he reached out to me, and we went out to this property actually and checked it out a little bit. Now, I don't really do too much field research. I'm not out to prove Bigfoot exists. I'm kind of more interested in the stories, but certainly, this kind of is something that I'm very interested in. And I was like, yeah, I'd love to come by and check it out. He had taken some photos from across the street. There's a patch of woods, and that would be his home right there in the middle picture. And he found these prints, which are very deteriorated in this picture. Unfortunately, you can't really see a whole lot. They've melted a lot of, something. It looks like it almost led up to the tree, and he thought maybe it could have been watching them from there while they were outside. It's hard to say from the photos, but he did do a good job, and he took a business card. That's another thing you can use, actually. If you don't want to take a dollar bill, you could take a business card. Those are usually the same dimension. So that's another thing. He actually has a card here, just kind of to help document that. So we went out to this area and we walked around, and we took some drone shots. And this is a shot taken in that area. You have the power line that connects through that area, and it's all just woods and mountains all around. And we went through, and we actually were walking through this frozen swamp, and I think we fell into a couple feet into the ice there. It wasn't too much water. It was just mostly ice. It was funny. It was a funny little encounter. But we checked out the area. We found plenty of evidence of other wildlife, deer, squirrels, that sort of stuff, the animals you'd usually expect. And animals do use power lines to actually traverse. It's the path of least resistance. That's where it's an easy way to get through, not having to deal with the woods. I mean, our paths, we use them for a reason, because we don't have to go crawling through all these roots and all this kind of stuff. And animals certainly use that too. So some people have perhaps said, maybe there's a connection with Bigfoot sightings and power lines. I've actually had some stuff happen in an area in New Hampshire as well, where there's been power lines involved. So it's kind of an interesting idea that maybe if other animals are using these, that perhaps these things, if they exist, they are doing that as well. But like I said, these are just a couple pictures, a couple of drone shots from the area here. Now, this is a bit of a humorous one. This is Bigfoot break-ins. So this was an article actually posted in August of 2019 in the Conway Daily Sun, Conway, New Hampshire, of course, up near the White Mountains, where there was a description, and I'm just going to have to pull this open to read this again. Bigfoot break-ins. So this is a satirical letter sent to the editor. So there had been some break-ins going on in some homes in that area that were most likely due to bears, but somebody had written a funny kind of article that I'm going to or a funny editorial, and I'll share that with you guys. We all know about these bear break-ins across the northern parts of the valley. Cars and houses getting broken into and stolen from by apparent bears. But after extensive research, I am confident that these break-ins are actually the presence of SASQUATCH, is being covered up by Fish and Game. But why do I think this? You see, when the bear first broke into Spruce Mountain, they set up traps to catch it and caught it the next day. But soon after, another break-in was reported at Spruce. There's no way two bears thought to do the exact same thing 2 times in a row. The trap was just a decoy so the public would not notice. Sasquatch are very smart creatures. They wouldn't fall into a trap. Although some may not realize Sasquatch are native to this area. With forests similar to the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast creates excellent habitat for Bigfoot. After much human intervention, supplies are becoming scarce, and Bigfoot is resorting to invading homes and vehicles. I still cannot understand why people think bears could so easily open the car doors. They don't have opposable thumbs. The Sasquatch, on the other hand, does, allowing him to open doors like humans. So this is, as I mentioned, it is a satirical article. So it was written in jest. I mean, it was kind of obvious that the bears were doing this, but you can kind of understand how maybe some people might think otherwise. But I thought that was a funny little one I wanted to share with everyone. Just that goes to show that Bigfoot is always on people's minds in a way. Monadnock region, 2 nights out in August. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this, but because it's a little bit of an ongoing thing. But last August, I was camping in an area I like to go in with a friend of mine, and we had some kind of things circling our camp all night, and we didn't really think too much of it. I had an audio recorder actually running while we were sleeping, and it wasn't until months later when I was discussing with some other researchers about an area they investigated that I realized it was the same area. So I went back and listened to that audio, and we have, right after we fall asleep, some knocks and noises and things going on all around the campsite. And, I'm not saying that's Bigfoot, but what's interesting is I've been going back to this area pretty consistently since the coronavirus lockdown sort of happened. I would spend a lot of time out in the woods after doing daily work and just head out there. And I was having some interesting encounters with knocks and that sort of stuff going on at night. And I've since befriended as well a gentleman in the area who claims to have activity going back decades near his property there. So it's an interesting area. I've taken some folks out there, and we've had some things happen just in terms of knocks. And there's, of course, no way of saying that's 100% Bigfoot or anything. I'm not claiming that. It's just interesting. I've posted to this YouTube channel, actually, the audio. So if you're curious, you can hear some of the audio on there. Posted that a couple months back. Just some of these strange knocks and weird noises that either way, I mean, we're sleeping in our tent and this kind of stuff was going on around us. So there was clearly something walking around and making a ruckus while we were sleeping, which we had no idea. Just a little bit kind of creepy to think about that. So those are just some of my favorite sort of New Hampshire stories. And before I start wrapping up here, getting ready for the documentary, I just wanted to say, as I mentioned earlier, if anyone has any New Hampshire stories or stories they were told growing up, stories from their grandparents, anything like that they want to share, please feel free to email me at alexanderpedikov@yahoo.com, or just go to my website, Pedikov Media, where you can get my email, and where you could leave a comment on this video and just let me know if you have any of these stories. I'm hoping to compile a book of some sorts about a lot of these various stories that have taken place over the decades in New Hampshire. So if anyone has anything they'd like to share, I mean, it's been so interesting with these other library events where I've had people tell me their stories or tell me about stories I don't think I'd ever hear about normally, stuff that just does not exist online. It's confined to local areas, or it's something that somebody heard from somebody that grew up in an area, just interesting hearsay and that kind of stuff. So anyone that wants to share that kind of stuff, please don't hesitate to reach out. Just want to really quickly talk about some local research groups. So one of my favorites, and these guys are fantastic, there would be Team SASQUATCH. So that would be Jonathan Wilk and Dave McCullough and their whole crew. They've got a lot of people. Don't want to leave anyone out, but just so many great, fantastic folks. They operate in Massachusetts, but they've done some stuff in New Hampshire and other areas as well. And they do some fantastic work out in the Bridgewater Triangle area of southern Mass, southeastern Mass, into central Massachusetts, and the Quabbin area out in western Massachusetts. We were actually just filming with them recently with Small Town Monsters, as we were filming on the Trail of Bigfoot, the Journey out in western Mass. It was really interesting spending some time out there with them, and they've always just been great guys. And if you're looking for anything about Massachusetts or even some of the New Hampshire stuff, definitely talk to them, because they're on the right track and they're very open with their information, which I think is fantastic. This is just a map of some of the sightings that these guys have come up with for Massachusetts, and they've kind of plotted it down, as you can see with the little Squatch stickers. So they do some great stuff. A place to visit that has to do with this subject, of course, would be the International Cryptozoology Museum. Now, they are open in Maine currently after being closed down for months. So any support you can show to the museum be fantastic. They have an awesome online store too. So if you're looking for all kinds of cryptid, Bigfoot, souvenirs, anything like that, there's a ton on their website. Please check them out. Help support this really unique institution in Portland, Maine. This is Lauren Coleman, one of the world's foremost cryptozoologists. He's been in the field for 60 years now, something like that, written a lot of books on the subjects, everything ranging from Bigfoot to the giant snakes, humanoid creatures, flying creatures, everything. He's covered a lot, and he's got some cool displays. And there's just a couple examples of some of the stuff in the museum. They do a conference usually every year, and this was one of the years at the conference. You can see they have Bigfoot statues and memorabilia, and as well as Champ, which is another one of my personal favorite cryptids. Lots of other stuff. There's so much you can't even fit it all in pictures, of course. It's a really cool sort of place, especially if you're into the subject. Definitely a place to go check out. And they have a map of sightings in the Maine area. So that's something interesting to take a look at. So again, just plugging Granite State Bigfoot. It was just a really fun comic book to work on with Michael, and there's not a whole lot of them left out there. I'm hoping that we'll be able to get more sometime. But as Michael passed away, it's just a good way to honor his memory. Check out the comic, and it's a fun comic, and it's some of these stories that I've talked about tonight. Some of my favorite stories in New England and in this area. So, just kind of a fun little thing that we never really kind of came out of nowhere. I'd been talking to Michael, and he had basically asked me, are there any Bigfoot sightings in New Hampshire? And I was like, oh boy, there's more than a few. And I sent him a list, and he's like, man, we should do a comic about this. And we'll set them all in the 1970s, because that's, I think, when some of the most interesting ones took place. So it's kind of what the idea came from. So that's about that. Just want to thank you guys for listening to the presentation. So my website is pedikovmedia.com. Feel free to check that out. I've got links to other projects, to my blog posts, all sorts of stuff. With that being said, now let's transition over to the video section here. Let me just see if I can get this to work properly. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop in, actually, let's see. I'm going to go to the big screen for a second here. Share screen. Okay, so yeah, we're going to do Shyman of the White Mountains. We're going to screen that. And after that, we're gonna screen Shyman of the White Mountains. It's about 15 minutes long, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. So if anyone has any questions or anything like that, I see there's a lot of comments, so I'll check on those as we're watching the film here. But audio-wise, I'm really hoping this will work. I tested this out last week with Alex from the Nashua Public Library, who's awesome and very resourceful. So let me just see if I can get the audio to work, because it'll cut my audio off and it'll just show the documentary audio. So let's see if we can get that to work. And if you guys don't mind, when I hit play in the documentary, just someone can just say, I hear it, or I can hear it, just in the comments. That would be fantastic. So let me just see share audio. All right, guys. So see how it works. And like I said, please just leave me a comment if there's anything you guys can hear or not hear. So.
My name is Michael Eastman. I live in Berlin, New Hampshire. I'm retired now, was a artist, painter, and owned a business here in town for many years, about 21 years. And then prior to that, I was in the military for 4 years. And this is my hometown where I live. Many years ago, I went back to the people, Abenaki. As far as how I live my life today, a lot of it is founded on those very basic purposes of this topic. I approach it from that angle, more of a cultural angle than anything else. Rather than call them Sasquatch for the sake of retaining our language, I refer to them as Shyman or Tsatsipopa. I saw the very first one I saw up at the lake, up at Umbagog, or Wombagog, back in 1973, and I was sleeping out on the porch. It came walking through the woods. I could hear it, and as I laid there listening, I had taken off my glasses and put them on the sofa that I was sleeping on, and so they were above my head. I could hear it snapping off spruce tines and that kind of thing. But then it got really quiet, and as I laid there, and I wasn't really concerned about anything, and as I laid there, I was by myself. As I laid there, I smelled something, and it was a very heavy odor. Reminded me very similar to a monkey house kind of smell with almost a diesel, very unpleasant. And then I heard a sound on the screen, and I looked over. I hadn't put my glasses on. I was expecting to see maybe a big moth or something like that. And as I looked over, there was just this massive being standing there staring at me.
Hey guys, I'm sorry that this keeps glitching out. I'm having a lot of audio audio problems here. I don't know, audio and picture problems. It's just freezing my internet and computer up. So I'm gonna try it one more time here. If not, I will just have people check it out on their own. I'm really sorry about that, but we'll give it one more try here, guys. If not, we'll just cut through and skip to the Q&A for the rest of the presentation. So again, apologies for that, but let's give it another try, shall we?
off into the, there's an area that, like a wetland, and went into there. So that was my first experience, and actually the most terrifying. Then this past, in 2015, I saw a number of them. I decided to go out and do some research on Shyman. And in large part, the foundation of the research was that I wanted to prove that they're there, so that in fact, because I think they deserve the same this treatment as any other rare species that may be running about in a forest. So I went into the research with the hopes of getting legislation passed to protect them both from hunting and trapping. And so I went to an area where I knew that there was a family group of them. I'd found their area several years ago. I wound up calling it Woladoc so that I would not give away the location in discussing it with anyone. And I went in and spent the next 9 months going in roughly almost every day to observe and research and collect as much information as I possibly could.
Okay, guys, unfortunately, it's just going to keep happening, and I really hate to ruin people's experiences with watching this. So we're going to have to cut it off there. I'm really sorry, guys. Now, if I can just cut out of there. Yeah, it's a bummer. But I would say you could check that out on this YouTube channel. This documentary is still available for viewing. So sorry again, guys, about the audio. It's just, I don't know if it's the file is just too big, and because I have to screen share on this program that I'm using. But either way, if anyone has any questions at this time about the presentation, New Hampshire, anything like that, please just go ahead and start typing them in there, and I would love to take your questions. And obviously, if we were in person in the Nashua Library, we could be doing a kind of an in-person Q&A, but this is the next best thing. So I'll give people a few minutes here to maybe write a couple questions in there, and be happy to answer some questions and just talk about anything. And if anyone has any comments or anything, please feel free to share that as well. Any stories about New Hampshire sightings or anything like that that you'd like read out, I can actually highlight the question right on the presentation. So go for it, guys. So yeah, like I was saying, it's been tough with all the stuff that's been going on, but I'm hoping that, once things settle down, I'm able to do more research on the subject and go to some local libraries and that sort of thing. But all right, let's check out some of the questions here. We're getting a few questions in here. Let's see. Cindy Coughlin says, do you think the different sightings throughout the world are the same creature or different species? Thanks for the question, Cindy. That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I mean, we haven't really established that this thing even exists. I mean, I'm sure many of us probably lean more on the side that it does. But it's an interesting thing to consider. Are there different? There's definitely different descriptions, even within the United States. In the southern part of the country, there seems to be more of a shaggier hair, smaller in size, more human-sized, more ape-like almost. So pretty interesting. In other parts of the world, you have the orang pendek, which is smaller. It's described as a smaller type person. So I'd say there's probably different species out there. Absolutely. And there aren't different species of Sasquatch, but maybe there are different species of these relict creatures that are still out there, beings that that our ancestors might have interacted with in some level. So I think that's definitely an interesting question. And there's probably different phenomena going on in different areas, I would say. Just like there are different species of apes. You have gorillas and chimps. If you see a gorilla and a chimp, they look pretty different. You see an orangutan, it's a completely different creature. Yet maybe the descriptions might be somewhat similar in a basic kind of sense. Let's see. Colin Quigley asks, what do you think of lucid dreams related to Sasquatch / Bigfoot? It's a good question, Colin. I'm not entirely sure. I don't really have an experience with, I guess, lucid dreaming or hearing about it. I mean, I've heard of certain people describing, having things in their dreams. I've had some dreams that involved Bigfoot. I mean, I don't know if that really had anything to do with anything, but I'm not too familiar with that. So I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to chime in about lucid dreams relating to that. Some people talk about mind speak and telepathy and that sort of stuff. And I've talked about that before with guests I've had on my regular program talking about infrasound. So infrasound is something that animals like tigers and tigers and elephants and other species use to communicate, or even tigers can supposedly use it to stun their prey, kind of zap them almost. Elephants use it to communicate underground. There's not a lot we know about it. There's been some experiments with infrasound done on human beings where it's elicited feelings of depression or anger or anxiety and that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting, maybe that has something to do with the dreaming aspect. I don't know. I mean, it's really all completely speculation at this point. Kevin says, great presentation. Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate that. So Fenian Power asks, is there indigenous, I'm assuming, folklore from New Hampshire regarding Bigfoot? Yeah, there is to some extent. And without speaking for those people, just from what I've been told by people like Michael, who is involved in the communities, some of the tribal sort of affiliations and the people here in New Hampshire, there does seem to be some sort of folklore. That's kind of what Shyman of the White Mountains as a presentation was alluding to, that's kind of a way that some sort of a being was depicted. And as I talked about earlier in the presentation, there's a lot of different depictions across the country. Some are friendly, some are like forest giants, some are cannibal killers that will hunt the people. It really depends on the people you're talking to. I mean, I saw a really interesting, just to put something into perspective, really interesting presentation at one of the cryptozoology conferences in Portland, Maine, by a primatologist named Anna Nakaris, who researches these little monkey-like creatures called slow lorises in parts of Indonesia and other parts of Asia. And she would talk about how these little animals, apparently they're poisonous and they're a nocturnal, small creature. But you could go to 4 different tribes in the area. One tribe will revere this creature and think of it as sacred. Another one will kill these creatures. And another one will consider them demons and to be cursed. And if you see one, you're to be cursed. And it's all within a small area. So maybe it's similar like with other animals or something like a Sasquatch story. Maybe there's some tribes that see it as a something to be revered, some that don't. I just think that's a really interesting idea. Absolutely. Okay. Let's see. Jason says, you guys over there in the U.S. are lucky to have that amazing animal. Jason from Epping Forest. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, it's an interesting cultural phenomena in New Hampshire, especially with the United States in general. So do you think there's a paranormal component? In Australia, kids would chase it and see them go straight into the ground. I mean, I don't know. I've heard, obviously, stories about paranormal aspects as I've talked about. That some of the theories speculate that's the origins. I mean, I'm not really sure. I think a majority of the reports that I've heard and stories I've heard have mostly to do with people seeing it like you would see a moose or a deer or a buffalo, an animal trying to get away, or it's like a physical sort of thing. And there are some people who claim that there are other components, UFOs or orbs or things seen. I mean, I can't really speak to that. I just know from some of the folks that I've talked to, it's a majority describe seeing just an animal fleeing, basically, which is you'd expect something physical. So I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I think there's a lot we just don't really understand in general about the world. So that's very possible. Colin says, thank you for your answer. Yeah, of course. So Andy, kind of his question is very similar to this. Do you think aliens and Bigfoot actually have any correlation? So it's sort of like with the last question. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in the subject of aliens. Absolutely. UFOs is a big topic. I mean, all sorts of celebrities and politicians talk about it these days, and it's definitely big on everyone's minds. Very interesting subject. So maybe, you know, some people in some states, like Pennsylvania, other places, claims that there's a lot of Bigfoot and UFO activity. I mean, I don't know. It's certainly something fascinating to think about. So Cindy says, on a scale of all topics you research, where does Bigfoot rank for you in terms of interest? That's a good one. Thanks, Cindy. That's tough. I would have to say it's probably in the top 5 because, you know, I'm definitely interested in it. There are things like Champ and other subjects that I'm probably more interested in, but Bigfoot is just something I think that's so universal, because really any part of the United States that you go to, you can hear about local Bigfoot stories. I mean, just this week, I'm hoping to travel to Arizona to be filming about a local monster there called the Mogollon monster in northern Arizona, which is another one of these local Bigfoot stories. I think it's interesting because you have, you know, now in the modern context, the idea of Bigfoot as this story, but then you have so many local stories: the Wood Devils, the Flea monster, the Durham gorilla, all kinds of stories from across the country, even dating before you had that cultural term of Bigfoot. So very interesting. I just got a message here from Alex from the National Public Library. He was saying, don't worry about the technical issues. Yeah, well, we tried. I mean, like I said, if you guys want to check out the documentary, it's available right on this channel. But anyway, yeah, where was I? Excuse me. About the so Bigfoot definitely on the scale is definitely in like the top 5 for sure, because you know, I know areas fairly close to where I live in New Hampshire where there's activity ostensibly going on. So if something like Lake Champlain, Champ, which is probably my favorite cryptid, you know, I'm 3 something hours away. So it's not like I'm right there all the time. I can't look into it at all. And wherever you go, basically in North America, for the most part, you can look into local Bigfoot stories or hear about Bigfoot and other people that are interested in it. It's one of the more popular cryptozoology topics. Kevin asks, is there any government or academic research being done? Great question, Kevin. So there have been some kind of studies done. I'm not so sure about the government. There's been perhaps people involved in the government who have looked into this, similar to UFO and other subjects, but there's been private individuals, academics like Dr. Grover Krantz, John Green, some of the first people that really started looking into this subject in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the pioneers of the subject, so to speak. You know, they came from different academic backgrounds, or someone like John Green, who was a journalist. He just chronicled stories, where Grover Krantz, an anthropologist, looked into these stories from that perspective and tried to figure out where this thing might fit in a biological sense. In modern times, you have other people that are doing pretty solid academic research. You have, of course, Dr. Jeff Meldrum is probably one of the most famous now, very, you know, respected anthropologist from Idaho, who's lent his name to being associated with Bigfoot, and other folks as well. There are some groups out there, the Olympic Project and the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, that I can think of that do pretty solid work in terms of like peer review and having their stuff evaluated. But it's still, you know, most Bigfoot research, sightings, whatever you want to call it, is done on a very informal level. I mean, there are, you know, even a group like the BFRO, they have researchers and members who are ex-military, ex-police, lawyers, coming from various different professional backgrounds, that maybe that helps it helps kind of educate them in the sense of when they look into a case, or brings different qualities. So nothing super official. I think there's still a big scientific stigma to the subject, but I do appreciate the question, Kevin. Chris Spitzer asks, what makes New Hampshire sightings special in contrast to the ones in other parts of the country, and how did the phenomena influence the popular culture there? Well, the contrast is because New Hampshire is the best state in the country. That's how. Yeah, just kidding. I mean, it's, you know, in my opinion, it is. But I think that there's some pretty unique sightings in New Hampshire. As I mentioned, just the ones I talked about, even the presentation tonight, regarding the structures in the Ossipee Bald Mountain Curiosity. That one, I've never heard of another sighting that involves stone structures or wooden structures or anything like that. And people talk about these structures all the time. So I think that's pretty interesting. And the HOLLIS flea market monster, whatever you want to call it, that's a cool one as well. I think there's just a good collection of unique sightings. There's actually one that I heard of the last time I gave a physical Granite State Bigfoot talk at the Dover Public Library in Dover, New Hampshire. There was a lady who came up to me, and I'm still beating myself up for not taking her information down, but there was so many people in the crowd, I kind of lost focus as I was talking to so many people. But she told me that she knew somebody from northern New Hampshire, around the Berlin area in Stark, New Hampshire. There used to be a prisoner camp up there in World War II, and that German POWs that were logging in the area were telling stories about hearing or seeing these ape-like creatures in the woods. And obviously these guys were captured war prisoners. They had nothing to do with the local culture of Bigfoot and or the local stories of wood devils or anything like that. So I'd really be interested in getting more to the bottom of that kind of a story. I think that's pretty unique. I don't know, New Hampshire, every state has its absolute unique sightings and very interesting things going on, different terrain. Every state is different, obviously. Vermont has some pretty unique sightings. So does Maine. So does Massachusetts. New York, of course. Whitehall, New York. All these sorts of places have a lot of interesting history. I just think New Hampshire, obviously I'm biased, so that probably answers it. But how did the phenomenon influence the popular culture there? I would say it really hasn't. In general, in the Northeast, Bigfoot, probably Whitehall, New York is the only place I can think of where there's a celebration of the local monster. There's Bigfoot pizza, Bigfoot beer, restaurant, Sasquatch saloon, that kind of stuff. In New England, there really isn't. People don't really. It's I don't know. It's kind of polarized a little bit. People don't really talk about the subject very much. There's a lot of people out there who have activity, but there's not really like in Northern California, you can go to Willow Creek, or in Colorado, you can go to the Sasquatch Outpost Museum. In Fouke, Arkansas, you can visit the Monster Mart and learn all about the Fouke monster featured in the Legend of Boggy Creek and that sort of thing. So I would say that there is a very minimal impact on local culture in New Hampshire and in New England in general with this subject, which I think is a shame. Hopefully that'll change someday, because I think there's some really unique sightings up here. Probably the only thing I've seen is those wood cutouts people put of Bigfoot, and that picture I showed in my presentation, which shows that wood cutout in northern New Hampshire of Bigfoot in the forest critters, which I think is pretty cool. So it's turning around a little bit. You do see some places in gift shops now, they'll start selling, they got their moose mugs and all kinds of stuff, and then they'll have Bigfoot and they'll say something about New Hampshire. So I think it's just because there's a general knowledge about New Hampshire, but there's not really like a unique place. Like if you go to Hollis, so you're not going to find the Hollis flea monster gift shop or anything like that. That just doesn't exist. Whereas maybe in other places there's more of a local legend and aura built around a particular story. Okay, let's see, more questions. What is their diet? Do they prefer deer or elk? I don't know. I mean, I'm really not like a researcher that's tracking that sort of stuff. I've heard from stories that there are, they've been seen hunting, or there's been examples of people finding dead or mutilated animals. So you'd imagine if something like that was that large, it would need a lot of sustenance. So it probably would be an omnivore eating plants and all sorts of stuff. I mean, even you've just heard of a story here in New Hampshire, I was told, where somebody had said, they're coming out of a cave and going to pick blueberries when the blueberries are out. We know bears do that. Bears are opportunistic and they'll go for the blueberries just like people do when blueberries are in season. And there's been sightings. I can think of a couple from here in New Hampshire, one from northern New Hampshire as well, where a lady thought she was looking at a bear until it stood up on two legs and ran away, and it was while she was picking blueberries. All right. Cindy says, thank you. We really enjoyed the presentations. We saw the alien one at the library last summer. Oh, cool. Awesome. Yeah, that was, I think, Paul, that was my friend Paul. I made a little cameo there at the end. I was just there to check out his presentation, and he kind of had me come up to the stage, but that was fun. Philip Rowland asked, are there BF reports in the Brattleboro area? I'm assuming, are you talking about Brattleboro, Vermont? I don't know if there's a Brattleboro, New Hampshire. Maybe I'm just like terrible. But if you're talking about Brattleboro, Vermont, there absolutely are. There's what's called the Bennington Triangle area, where there's stories going back quite a while talking about hairy man-like creatures, and there's been Bigfoot sightings to this day. And even some of the stuff the SquatchAchusetts guys have done in western Massachusetts brushes up into that bottom corner of Vermont. It's all very similar terrain, wooded, heavily forested, lots of little rolling mountains and hills in that area. Philip says, follow-up, one would think an animal that size needs to eat that much, pretty much plenty of dung samples to be found. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, Vermont. Okay, yeah, so like I said, yeah, no, you're right. There's definitely, I mean, there's been some people saying they found scat and that sort of stuff, but nothing really super conclusive, and it's just another element of the mystery. You know, how do you really square that away? I don't know. Rocket Reindeer says, John Bindernagel was a wildlife biologist who didn't believe in them until he started studying them. Yeah, that's a really good point. John Bindernagel unfortunately passed away recently, but absolutely fantastic researcher, who's a biologist from British Columbia. He wrote probably one of my favorite books on the subject, which is written almost like a field guide. Like you would read a field guide about moose or elk or any sort of wildlife. He wrote that about Sasquatch, talking about sightings and behavior and that sort of stuff. I have a copy of the book somewhere. It's fantastic. Really, it's hard to find nowadays, but one of the best written books on the subject because it reads so scientifically. It reads just like a field guide to, like I said, any other species. So yeah, thanks for bringing up John Bindernagel. Andy Alvarez asks, do you ever come to Washington? I'm sure there's tons of stories out here. Yeah, I've never been to Washington State, actually, but it's the number one for the amount of reports in North America. So I would love to come out to Washington State. Hopefully at some point, that would be awesome, because there's plenty of encounters out there, and there's a lot of great territory. And as I talked about during the presentation, even showing the map, how, you know, the rainforest, the temperate rainforest, and the Cascade Mountains, there's sightings all throughout the state. Colin says, live free or die. Absolutely. That's the motto of New Hampshire, of course. Guy 15 says, could you tell us more about the studies of the man and Shyman of the White Mountains? Sorry, I forgot his name. Yeah, it was Michael Eastman. Yeah, he is a researcher up there in northern New Hampshire. And it was just interesting. You know, I came into contact with him, as I said, kind of a few years ago, and we started, you know, kind of coming up with the idea to do the film together. And I've kept in touch with him since then. And yeah, he just kind of approaches it from that sort of Native American perspective, I guess you could say. So it's kind of interesting to, you know, that sort of approach, where it's coming more from the idea that he's not really there trying to kill one or capture one or prove anything. He's just sort of interested in that from that cultural perspective. So Chris says, thank you for the great answer. I missed the first part of the presentation while making dinner. I'm going to rewatch it later. Yeah, that part went pretty well because there were no technical difficulties in terms of the film. We tried to show that, but you know, the PowerPoint, I think, kind of speaks for itself. Thanks. Oh, yeah, there we go. Kevin says, thank you, Alex. I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. Philip says, thanks for this great job, Alex. Yeah, thank you, Philip. Thanks, everyone, for commenting. And I think we're going to start wrapping it up here. Just coming in now, almost 2 hours. So technical difficulties aside, I think hopefully everyone enjoyed it. This was a lot of fun. I wish it could have been in person in the Nashua Public Library, but hopefully we'll be able to do that at another point. So I do want to say, though, I am having a library talk in August. Let me just check the calendar here, high-tech calendar. On the 6th of August, so that's Thursday, I will be doing a presentation this is terrible. I'm forgetting the name of the town. I think it was at Grafton, New Hampshire. We'll be doing a library talk up there, and it's actually going to be in person. We're going to do sort of a 10-person in the room capacity, and it will be streamed again on here. I'm going to try and figure that out. The Guilford Public Library, excuse me. I'd set to have a lot of library talks this summer and into the fall. Obviously, that was before all this kind of stuff happened. So this is all new to me, but we're hoping to make the in-person one work and kind of take it from there. Patty Burke says, great job. Enjoyed a lot. Thank you, Patty. Really appreciate that. Stephen Jeffers says, thanks. Thank you. Philip asks, have you ever met and worked with Chris Noel? I have met Chris. Yeah, I met him at a BFRO event in New Hampshire that he hosted a few years ago. I've never worked with him. I'm familiar with some of his work he's over in Vermont. So I've never really worked with him, but yeah, I met him. Seems like a real nice guy. So yeah. So with that said, guys, thank you again. For those of you tuning in that, we're hoping to see the Nashua talk, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening, and thanks for hanging out with me tonight. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you're not, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, because I do a regular show on Monday nights with all sorts of guests. Just last night we had Eric Altman. We were talking about Pennsylvania Bigfoot stories and encounters, and he had some really great stuff, really great encounters and that sort of stuff. So for those of you that are regular viewers or watch the live stream, thank you guys for tuning in as well. I hope this was interesting. I know it was about more specific areas, about New Hampshire is kind of my neck of the woods. So it's a lot of fun to talk about that, and definitely encourage everyone to check out the show. And if you want to see Shyman of the White Mountains, it's available. It's episode 3 of the documentary series on the YouTube channel. So if you can, you want to check it out there, as it didn't really work for us tonight, that would be a great place to do it. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that. Alrighty, guys. Well, again, thanks, everyone. Hope you have a good night. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Bye-bye.